Welcome back to Mapping Healthcare on KDRT 95.7 FM in Davis, California, where a medic with a map explores healthcare around the world, highlights people who improve it, and shares what we can learn from them. This is your host, Dr. Sheikh. In today's episode of Mapping Healthcare, we're dealing with a question that gets right to the heart of mental health. How much of our inner world is actually shaped by the world around us? For the longest time, the field of mental health worked like the answer was a simple yes. Like depression in Oslo feels exactly the same as depression in Oklahoma City. But what if that's not the whole story? What if the very language we use to talk about our pain, and maybe even the pain itself, is deeply cultural? For a long time, the approach was pretty clinical. Find the disorder, find the label, treat the symptoms. But that's all evolving, and it's thanks to two really big changes in how we think about mental health care. On the one hand, we're moving from being patient-centered to person-centered. That might sound like a small change in words, but the difference is huge. And on the other hand, we're starting to move from the one-size-fits-all model and instead view mental health through a cultural lens. So let's start with that first change. What does this more personal approach really look like in practice? Basically, it's about moving away from only asking what's wrong with you and starting to ask what really matters to you. In this way of thinking, the diagnosis and the treatment plan aren't the end goal. They're tools to help a person build a life they actually want to live. A person is more than their illness and lives within their culture and circumstances. And to look at a person's cultural influences, we can use a model called the cultural influences on mental health. It shows us how culture has a role to play at every stage, from the very cause of an illness to how we express it to treatment. So does our culture actually shape the kinds of stress that can lead to mental health issues in the first place? For a lot of people, the sources of stress aren't just the usual challenges of life. They can include things like adapting to a new educational environment or a new part of the world, or to dealing with racism and discrimination, poverty, violence, being a migrant or a refugee. There's also conflict within families between generations who hold different cultural values. So when we talk about risk factors, we can't just look at an individual's biology or their personal story. We have to see the bigger social, economic, and political forces that place a burden on communities. And once that distress is there, how is it actually expressed? The answer to that is deeply cultural too. In many Western cultures, we're taught to talk about our feelings, to use language like, I feel sad or I'm anxious. But in so many other cultures, distress speaks through the body. It's expressed somatically, through physical complaints. Headaches, dizziness, stomach pains, or overwhelming fatigue. It's not that the emotional pain isn't there, it's just that the body becomes the primary language for it. So just think for a second about the huge implications that has for a clinician trying to make an accurate diagnosis. Without that cultural context, a clinician can easily get it wrong. So if the causes of distress are different and the language of distress is different, it just makes sense that the path to getting help is going to be different too. For many people and communities, the path to a therapist's office is full of barriers. Stigma is often the largest challenge, the fear of embarrassment or of being labeled. Then there's mistrust that stems maybe from a history of discrimination in healthcare. And on top of that, you have the practical barriers like cost and language. And because of these issues, the journey for help often looks different in people. Help could be first sought from family and the community. Then maybe a priest or a pastor. There may be a family practitioner who could be seen for physical symptoms. Or indigenous or alternative healers may be the next for some people. A mental health specialist could be the very last stop on this journey, if they ever get there at all. Our guest in today's episode of Mapping Healthcare is Professor Ingunn Marie Engebretsen. We talk about her global health research in the area of person-centered care for mental health. The views expressed on the show are mine and those of my guests. So, Ingunn, welcome to Mapping Healthcare. You are a professor at the Center for International Health at the University of Bergen in Norway. And you have an MD and a PhD from the University of Bergen. You are an expert in child mental health. So tell us a little bit about what got you interested in the field of mental health.
Thank you, Ulfat. It has been a journey. First of all, prior to my medical studies, I was interested in child health. I realized that when I studied humanities, that actually my passion was for child health. So medical school was kind of interesting in the sense I think I was one of those that enjoyed medicine, psychiatry, neurology, that part of the studies most, but kind of when I had 1 week only with global health towards the end of my studies, I felt really happy. So I was fortunate to be exposed to an environment in Bergen where I still am that was very active in international slash global health. That's what we called it back in the days. I started with breastfeeding, and this was in the period of breastfeeding and HIV, and dwelled in that field for my PhD and actually much longer. And then, right there and then, I think actually I realized that it's more than just the somatic part of it. It's more than just growth. It's really the entire development. It's the mental health of the parents. It's the nutritional status of the children. So connected with so many factors that is affecting their conditions, their upbringing, their development. So kind of I got interested in the entire holistic picture of child health. And then, as with many other young researchers, money ran out, and I looked out for a clinical job, and I was lucky again, and I got placement in child psychiatry. So I stayed in child psychiatry for 3 years. Then I was pulled back again into research again, then with some experience from those 3 years. And now I would say that nutrition and child development and child mental health has kind of gone hand in hand after that.
You've had a long career in global health research with a focus on child health, as you mentioned. Your areas of research have included substance use among children and child mental health and development, and the epidemiology and the management of substance use and mental health issues, especially for children and teens, have changed over the years. So, over the past few years, how has your perception of mental health changed over the span of your career?
It has happened in parallel. We're getting older and being a mom and being an academician. So I think, as for many of us, I mean, I don't know whether it's so much a change as more like a maturation, where you kind of see the interconnectedness between so many factors that are affecting us all. My view on mental health goes far beyond the research questions today. I think I look at it in a much more systemic way. I'm very, very interested in parenting as such, parent meaning the person having parental responsibilities and care for children. And I think kind of that has probably matured with working with parents, doing my clinical work, and also being a parent, and kind of acknowledging the immense hardship so many people are having with extreme vulnerabilities, with all types of uncertainties, and also all sorts of exposures to difficult conditions far beyond my imagination, actually. And I respect that entire complex system, which is both at the individual level, but also at a much larger societal level. And in that, we are raising our children that we love more than we can explain. And we just want the best for these children. And that's kind of also where I think it becomes complex. I do feel that children in our priorities, when you really look at the money, when you really look at global kind of discourse, when you look at policies, when you look at news, just think about COVID-19. The children of the world generally suffered so much, maybe in an interest which wasn't necessarily theirs. And they still pay the price for their losses back in those years.
Yeah, for sure. And I remember chatting with you a year and a half ago when we first met about the COVID-19 pandemic and how it affected not just our professional approach to taking care of our patients, but also personally. You and I have kids that are about the same age ourselves, and helping them and seeing the challenges they had during that difficult period was a conversation that you and I had had back then. And it's difficult for people who live with mental health conditions to discuss the challenges they face and to seek help. There's a real stigma around mental health, and in many parts of the world, people find it difficult to access mental health services. A big factor that plays into this problem can be a lack of awareness about the causes and the management of mental health conditions among clinicians and the public. So, based on your research and your experience, what are some common myths and misconceptions that healthcare providers and health systems in Norway have about mental health?
I think now in Norway, we have an increased focus on mental health. It's much more acceptable to talk about mental health, particularly among the youth. And that is a positive development in many ways. Increased awareness and increased acceptance for talking about mental health in general. And talking about things that might be challenging, bullying, eating disorders, different traumas people might have experienced. We often see, even here in this relatively rich part of the world, that when it's really serious conditions, serious suffering, we struggle a bit with providing the necessary care, particularly in the transition between the referral health system and the primary health system. So we see that when there are priorities which are made at maybe the municipality level or at local level, very often these type of care systems or preventive systems or these kind of activities where it's harder to kind of prove that you have an immediate effect, those kind of services are often losing out when it comes to financial priorities. And I think that is maybe because it's not fully acknowledged how useful these services are and how much they matter to those suffering most. That is not only harmful for the individual, it's harmful for their children, it's harmful for their parents, and creates much more instability and uncertainty.
And understanding a person's cultural background is crucial for effective mental health treatment. So, Ingunn, in addition to your professional experience in Norway, you've also studied child health in many other parts of the world, such as Ethiopia, Tanzania, Zambia, Burkina Faso, Uganda, the Democratic Republic of Congo, South Africa, and the Philippines. So, from your work and your research, give us a couple of examples of how culture affects mental health, specifically in Norway.
Culture affects mental health, definitely it does. I think it's pretty well documented that kind of our classical diseases might kind of appear across cultures, that being bipolarity, schizophrenia. Then there are certain places, and that can typically be go hand in hand with vulnerabilities and poor economic status, etc. I mean, we see huge amount of anxiety and depression, particularly among children in many low-income countries, and that we have seen in both the literature and in our data. And how much of that is culture and how much of that is actual quite immense stress. The expression of a variety of symptoms can be cultural. The reasons for the reactions will be context dependent. And you need to know a culture pretty well to kind of recognize what is in your data. If you don't understand what's going on, you won't understand the mental health in a way.
So clearly, culture influences mental health. It shapes how people perceive and they express their symptoms, their willingness to seek help, and the coping mechanisms that people have. And it also plays a role in cultural stigma around mental health and the role of family and community support. So, in your mind, what are some steps that health systems can take to consider culture when screening for and managing mental health issues? So, specifically, I'm trying to figure out how can we take a range of treatment preferences into account so that we move toward a more person-centered approach to mental health care.
Yeah, that's a beautiful question, and I wish we had a quick fix for it. But a few reflections from my side were my few years in child psychiatry left me over and over and over again with an immense respect for the parents that I met. But it's also part of our culture in the more Western Nordic sphere to have a lot of skepticism against mental health services, against psychiatrists, against psychologists. And there will be many, many children suffering, and their parents never consider whether they should approach any system at all. So I think if we could do something more in terms of securing parents, working early with parents, where if a child is typically doing things which is not accepted, that child needs more than everybody else to be included. That parent needs more than everybody else to be included. And very often we see that's not the case. To answer your very complex question, I think if we could really care for the carers, it's like these people say on the airplane, put on your own oxygen mask first. It's so true when it comes to caring for children.
So, those were some really excellent points you raised, Ingunn, about the effect of the mental health of caregivers, of carers on children. So, let's talk about a specific high risk group of individuals that are at risk for mental health concerns. So, forced migration is the involuntary movement of people away from their home or their country due to factors beyond their control like war or civil conflicts, persecution, natural disasters, environmental changes, or economic hardships. And the consequences of forced migration are quite different from those of voluntary migration, and they can have profound effects on both the people who migrate and the people in the regions that the migrants enter. Some of your work includes mental health care among children and young adults in refugee groups. So tell us a little bit about this work.
Yeah, um, we we all follow the news and the numbers, and we see this is an increasing group. And I think, when we have come in with research, it's very often been in post-conflict areas. But more recently, I've also worked a little bit with young scholars, like young adults or students. And I think it's something we as academicians encounter in our roles, one way or another, as teachers, as scholars. We recently did some research among a group of students in this country that were here because they had fled from persecution and for political reasons. And it became quite clear from the data that kind of for them to seek help in our systems, our kind of regular services weren't enough. Language was not the biggest barrier because most of us speaks at least some level of English. But it was kind of that the very kind of stringent system where you get 1 to 5 talks and so time, etc., etc. It was so strict and so limited. And that coupled with, well, either it was during COVID or immediately after, with relatively kind of small networks in the study places and so on, made loneliness quite serious. And I think kind of as a scholar, as an academician, as a teacher, and as a doctor, I actually wonder about how much of what we do in teaching and in communication and in supervision, which is not trauma sensitive. I think it's fairly obvious that, of course, it will vary with the exposure and the personality and the resilience and everything. But in general, I mean, people have encountered an enormous amount of stress. People have encountered an enormous amount of losses. And those two things together, I mean, are obvious kind of risk factors for increased vulnerabilities and mental health challenges, at least, with socially, with kind of general functioning, with relationships. And when the system is very rigid and quite limited, and you are new in a country or new in a place, you may not actually benefit from it at all. So that's what we may see in this country. And for migrants being in much kind of poor health systems, or having migrated within from one poor country to another poor country where there's also relatively weak systems, I think it's a growing body of literature showing that doing something systematic and doing something with this focus is actually very promising. It's helpful. But I mean, what we have also seen in some of our networks, and you and they are putting an intense focus on that right now. I mean, well, one needs to acknowledge that, but one also needs to acknowledge that people need to move onwards. People need work, people need education, and so on. So there are new initiatives in that regard, and I think that also has a both a preventive and therapeutic effect. And this comes, of course, in various stages after the displacement itself. I mean, of course, first things first. If you are running, then you need to find shelter and safety. So, of course, these things needs to come in the right order, but not be forgotten. People have offers and there are opportunities, but it's quite easy to fall between multiple chairs. So how well are things organized and how well are things funded? That is something we need to take with us, particularly us having a little bit of knowledge about the importance of both the elements, both the systems, but also the activities and care.
That's a really good point about trauma sensitive care or trauma informed care. That's an approach that recognizes that there is an impact of trauma on mental health and it seeks to address it and not ignore that aspect of a person. And, really good point about young adults who enter the educational system and sometimes fall between the cracks where this isn't picked up in the midst of their academic difficulties. So, you've really, through your work, had an impact on mental health care across the globe. So, you work in Bergen, Norway, but have had quite a bit of reach in global health and global mental health and made a difference worldwide. And Ingunn, we end each episode of Mapping Healthcare by talking about a place that our guest is associated with so that our listeners are familiar with the environment that they work in. And you've spent a long time in Bergen, Norway, first for your education and then your career in healthcare. So tell us a little bit about a couple of places or experiences in the city that people new to the area should check out.
Oh, thank you. That's an easy one. Yeah, for me, I'm kind of I'm seeking my own care. We are both academicians, and we both mentioned that work demands can be pretty intense, and volume in terms of what you're expected to read and what you're expected to deliver can sometimes be quite overwhelming. So I need quite a bit of time alone. And I know Bergen has it all in terms of nice cafes and small kind of places where you go to a variety of concerts. It's a concert city. I mean, we have had the all composers Grieg for those that love that type of music to very kind of nice pop and jazz environments. So we have classical festival in May. We have a jazz festival. We have all of that. But personally, I actually like to seek towards the mountains and find space and find just the view. And it's so easy to get it. It's just, you don't need to go one of the two most famous trails up from the city center. You just pick a third one and you're there. There are lots of nice apps for instance, ut.no, ut.no, and you see all the trails, and they are in walking distance from most of the places in the city. That's one thing I did during COVID-19, was actually to decide for myself that each time I was hiking, I should try out a new hiking trail. And I still haven't walked them all. And I have been here more than half my life. So that's something I really enjoy about the city, is that we can do that almost any time. Maybe part of my upbringing, and that's where I find myself recharging.
Yeah, and a great way to reduce stress and anxiety and to get closer to nature. For sure, Bergen, I remember my visit there has these amazing mountains that surround a really dynamic city. So, a wonderful part of the world to be in, and a wonderful part of the world from which to continue all the amazing work that you've been doing to basically surmount all of the obstacles and mountains that come in the way of child mental health. And thank you for being on Mapping Healthcare.
Thank you.
So that was Professor Ingunn Marie Engebretsen telling us about how culture shapes mental health and molds our response to stress and adversity. So putting all of this together, what does a system that truly gets the relationship between culture and mental health look like? How do we start to build better, more culturally competent care? Research points to some really clear best practices. We can start by building multicultural teams and providing them with training to address bias. We can create strong links with community leaders who people already trust. We can integrate cultural practices like spirituality or complementary medicine into treatment plans. And we have to recognize that mental health is tied to real-world problems. So, advocacy for things like housing and legal aid becomes a part of the healing process. And finally, culture is more than just ethnicity. Our age, abilities, family, spirituality, religion, or gender do not exist in a vacuum. A person's identity is where they all intersect, and each intersection creates a unique experience. Person-centered care doesn't see these factors as a checklist. It respects the whole person that emerges from all this beautiful complexity. The language of mental health may not be universal, but the need for understanding and compassion absolutely is. The challenge is to build health systems that listen not just to symptoms, but to the whole person in all their social and cultural complexity. Thanks for tuning in. This was your host, Dr. Sheikh. You were listening to Mapping Healthcare on KDRT 95.7 FM. You can connect with the show on Instagram at Mapping Healthcare if you'd like to share your thoughts and ideas for future episodes or guests. You can hear Mapping Healthcare around the world anytime on kdrt.org and wherever you get your podcasts.